"I served this country for 20 years, and now I feel like I'm begging for scraps," a veteran told a local reporter outside a VA clinic, a moment of profound shame that drove Samuel L. Jackson to bypass Washington and take his outrage directly to the public. That single sentence, spoken by a man with slumped shoulders and hollowed eyes, became the spark that lit a digital wildfire. Before the local Ohio news station that first aired the clip had even finished its nightly broadcast, a recording of the segment was ricocheting across the internet. But it was Jackson's intervention that turned it from a fleeting moment of regional sympathy into a national crisis of conscience. His raw, direct-to-camera Instagram video, posted without warning, was viewed over 1 million times in the first hour. It wasn't just shared, it was endorsed, with thousands of comments flooding in from other veterans, their families, and active-duty service members, all echoing the same sentiment. "He's right. This is happening." Within 3 hours, every major news network in the country had scrapped their planned segments to play Jackson's video in its entirety, forcing a conversation the White House was wholly unprepared to have. The week began with the familiar pageantry of presidential power. 3 days prior, President Donald Trump stood at a podium at Joint Base Andrews, the formidable silhouette of Air Force One behind him. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, a perfect backdrop for a message of unassailable strength. He was there to sign a new defense spending bill, and the crowd before him was a sea of crisp, uniformed service members. Trump was in his element, feeding off their disciplined energy. He spoke of new technologies, of global dominance, and of America's unparalleled military might. Then, he arrived at the part of the speech written for applause lines. "We love our military, and we love our vets," he boomed, his voice echoing across the tarmac. "And this administration, more than any administration in history, is proving it. We are delivering record funding for our incredible vets, the best health care, the best support. We are taking care of our heroes like never before." The applause was thunderous and sustained. Watching from the front row, White House aides exchanged self-congratulatory smiles. The message was clear. The optics were perfect. For them, the issue of veteran care was a talking point that had been successfully delivered and, therefore, resolved. 250 miles away, in a suburb of Columbus, Ohio, Arthur Pendleton felt none of that triumphant certainty. At 62, Arthur's service was 2 decades in his past, but it lived in his body every day. It was in the ache in his replaced knee, and the permanent ringing in his ears from his time as an artilleryman. His pride, however, had always been intact. He was a man who had served. He had done his part. That pride was the first thing to crack when he received the letter from the local VA clinic. His long-awaited appointment with a specialist for his deteriorating hearing, an appointment he had waited 7 months for, was canceled. The reason given was administrative restructuring and budgetary reallocation. When he called, a tired-sounding clerk told him the earliest she could reschedule was in another 5 months. "Maybe. We've had some cuts, sir," she'd explained, her voice a monotone of practiced apology. "Everyone is being affected." For a week, Arthur stewed in a quiet, corrosive shame. He didn't tell his wife the appointment was canceled. He just said it was moved. He felt like he had done something wrong, as if this bureaucratic failure was a personal failing. He was a soldier. Soldiers didn't complain. They adapted. But the feeling of being discarded, of being reduced to a line item that could be erased, was eating at him. So when he went to the clinic to try and plead his case in person, only to be handed a form and told to mail it in, something inside him finally broke. He was walking out, his head down, when a young woman with a microphone and a cameraman in tow approached him. Her name was Melina Vance, a reporter for a local news affiliate. "Sir, we're doing a story on the impact of recent VA budget shifts. Would you be willing to share your experience?" Arthur's first instinct was to say no, to retreat back into his private humiliation. But then he looked at the clinic, at the other older men and women sitting on benches with the same look of weary resignation he felt. And the words just tumbled out. He wasn't speaking to the camera. He was just confessing. "I served," he began, his voice thick with emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel. 20 years. I never asked for anything." He looked down at his hands, turning his worn ball cap over and over. "Now my hearing is going. They cancel my appointment. Tell me maybe next year. I feel like I'm begging for scraps." The shame was right there, on his face, in the way he couldn't meet the reporter's eyes. He felt like a failure. Samuel L. Jackson was not looking for a cause. He was in his Los Angeles home, in the quiet of his study, scrolling through his tablet. It was his downtime, a rare moment to decompress between projects. He swiped past movie news, past political hot takes, past celebrity gossip. Then he saw a post from an old friend from his home state of Tennessee. It was the clip from the Columbus news station. The caption read, "This is my wife's uncle. The man is a hero, and they're treating him like this." Jackson tapped play. He watched the clip once, the audio low. He saw Arthur Pendleton's slumped shoulders and heard the tremor in his voice. Then he put in his earbuds and watched it again, this time closing his eyes to listen. He heard every crackle of pain, every ounce of shame in the words, "begging for scraps." That phrase hooked into him, a toxic barb. It was the language of the forgotten, the dismissed. He opened his eyes, and the image of Arthur's face, a portrait of quiet dignity being stripped away, was seared into his mind. Almost immediately, his brain cross-referenced it with another image. President Trump, beaming at the podium just 2 days before, preening about record support and taking care of our heroes. The disconnect was so profound, so jarring, it felt like a personal insult. It was the hypocrisy of it all. The loud, empty promise set against the quiet, devastating reality. This wasn't a political issue to him at that moment. It was a moral one. It was about a promise made and a promise broken. He had played soldiers, generals, and leaders on screen. He understood the concept of a sacred pact, the covenant between a nation and its defenders. And in Arthur Pendleton's eyes, he saw that pact being shredded and thrown away like trash. He didn't call his agent, he didn't consult his publicist, or draft a carefully worded statement. He knew that manufactured outrage was weak. This required something real. He stood up, left his study, and walked to a simple, unadorned wall in his home, his tablet still in hand. He propped it up against a stack of books, opened his Instagram app, and switched the camera to video. The time for quiet anger was over. He pressed the red record button. There was no introduction, no, "Hey everybody." He started by playing the news clip of Arthur Pendleton directly from his tablet, holding it up to his phone's camera. He let the entire 1-minute segment play. He wanted his millions of followers to see Arthur's face, to hear his voice, to understand the depth of his shame before they ever saw or heard from Jackson himself. He wanted Arthur's truth to be the opening argument. When the clip finished, a profound silence hung in the air. Jackson lowered the tablet, and the camera refocused on his face. The expression he wore was not the explosive fury of his famous film characters. It was something colder, heavier, and far more dangerous. A look of absolute, immovable certainty. "You see that man?" he began, his voice low and raspy, a quiet rumble that commanded attention more than a shout ever could. "His name is Arthur Pendleton. He served this country for 20 years. He didn't ask for a parade. He didn't ask for a statue. He just held up his end of the deal." Jackson leaned in slightly, his eyes boring into the lens as if he were looking into every home, every office, every barracks in the country. "There's a deal that gets made when you sign up. You write a check to this country for an amount up to and including your life. And in return, the country, through its government, signs one back to you. A promise. A promise that if you get hurt, if you need help, if you come home a little less whole than when you left, we've got your back. That is the fundamental contract. That is the promise that allows us to sleep at night." He paused, letting the weight of the word promise settle. A couple of days ago, the president stood up and talked about record support for our incredible vets. Big, beautiful words from a big, shiny podium. It sounded good. It got a round of applause. He shook his head slowly, a look of profound disappointment on his face. But words don't stop the ringing in a man's ears. A speech doesn't get you an appointment with a doctor. And a round of applause doesn't pay the bills. He then pointed a single, steady finger at the camera. So let's forget the speeches. Forget the numbers on a teleprompter. Look at his face. Look at Arthur Pendleton's face again. That is the truth. The rest is just noise. He took a final, deep breath and delivered the lines that would detonate across the political landscape. We write a check when they enlist, and it better not bounce when they come home. What we all just saw, that look of shame on a good man's face, that is a bounced check. It is a promise broken. To the President, to Congress, to the VA, to every single person who claps at a parade and then looks away. Make it good. He held his gaze for another 3 seconds, then simply reached out and ended the recording. He hit post. The fuse was lit. The explosion was immediate and overwhelming. For a moment, Jackson just watched the numbers on his screen climb with dizzying speed. 1,000 views became 10,000 in minutes. The share count clicked over like a gas pump meter on overdrive. But it was the comments section that told the real story. It was a digital dam breaking. My dad waited 14 months for a wheelchair ramp. He died before they approved it. I'm a VA nurse. We're understaffed, underfunded, and we're watching people like Mr. Pendleton fall through the cracks every single day. Thank you for saying this. My husband won't talk about it, but he has the same look in his eyes. It was a torrent of shared pain, a collective roar of frustration from every corner of the country. His phone began to vibrate against the tabletop, a frantic, insistent buzz. First, his agent, then his publicist. He ignored them both. He knew what they would say. What did you do? Why didn't you warn us? Do you know what you've started? Yes, he knew. That was the entire point. The silence in the White House was deafening. The initial strategy was clearly to ignore it, to treat it as just another celebrity outburst that would fade by the next news cycle. But this wasn't fading. Jackson's video wasn't a rant, it was a reckoning. It had given a face and a voice to a grievance that had been simmering just beneath the surface of the national consciousness. By framing it not as a political attack, but as a moral failure, a bounced check, he had made it accessible to everyone, regardless of their political affiliation. Dishonoring a promise to a veteran wasn't a left or right issue, it was an American issue. The first official response came not from the president, but from a rattled White House press secretary during the afternoon briefing. She tried to dismiss it, calling Jackson an out-of-touch Hollywood elite trying to score political points. But the reporters in the room didn't let it go. They weren't asking about Jackson. They were asking about Arthur Pendleton. They were asking about VA wait times in Ohio. They were asking about the budgetary reallocations. Jackson's video had successfully shifted the entire conversation from the messenger to the message itself. Later that evening, the call he was waiting for finally came. It was his wife, LaTanya Richardson Jackson. Her voice wasn't angry, but it was heavy, with a familiar, weary concern. "Sam," she said, the sound of a television news report murmuring in the background. "I just saw you on CNN." "I figured it would get there eventually," he replied, trying to keep his own voice level. "You just painted a giant red target on your back. You know that," she said softly. It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of fact from a woman who had been by his side through decades of fame and activism. "Sometimes you have to," he said. "I saw that man's face, Tanya. It was unacceptable." "I know," she sighed. "I saw it too. But you know what comes next. The machine will turn on you. The trolls, the threats. They'll try to dig up everything. Are you ready for that?" He looked out the window, the glow of the Los Angeles sunset painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. "I'm not the one who has to be ready," he said, his voice hardening with resolve. "They are. They broke a promise. I just mailed them the invoice." As he spoke, his social media notifications began to change. Interspersed with the messages of support were new, uglier comments. Vicious, anonymous accounts filled his mentions with threats, insults, and doctored photos. They called him a traitor, a hypocrite. The machine his wife had warned him about was revving its engines, beginning its work of trying to tear him down, to discredit his voice, and to make an example out of him for daring to hold power to account. The private cost of his public stand was just beginning to be calculated. The days that followed the posting of the video were a blur of escalating noise. The initial silence from the White House broke just after dawn the next day, not with a formal statement, but with a barrage of posts from the president's personal social media account. As predicted, Donald Trump's strategy was to attack the messenger, not the message. Failing actor Samuel L. Jackson, who is in desperate need of publicity, is lying about our amazing vets, one post read. He's part of the Hollywood elite swamp that hates our country. All he does is pretend to be a hero on screen, but he doesn't have a clue. Sad. Another followed minutes later. We have the best numbers for veteran care in history. The fake news and their celebrity puppets will do anything to stop our success. Don't believe the lies. The digital broadside had its intended effect, galvanizing the president's base and turning the national conversation into a furious, partisan brawl. Cable news channels became a dizzying grid of split screens. On one side, Jackson's cool, resolute face from his video. On the other, Trump's all-caps social media posts. Pundits screamed at each other across polished desks, debating Jackson's motives, his filmography, his political history. Anything and everything except the quiet, pained face of Arthur Pendleton. The fight was now exactly what the White House wanted it to be. A culture war skirmish between a celebrity and a president. And in Columbus, Ohio, Arthur Pendleton was hiding in his own home. The quiet street where he'd lived for 30 years had been transformed into a media encampment. News vans with satellite dishes lined the curb. Reporters, some shouting questions, others leaving notes in his mailbox, staked out his front lawn. His phone rang with unknown numbers until he finally unplugged it from the wall. He felt a tidal wave of shame, deeper and more profound than what he'd felt at the clinic. He hadn't asked for any of this. He had spoken his truth for 60 seconds, and in doing so, had seemingly brought a war to his own doorstep. I shouldn't have said anything, he murmured to his wife, Carol, as they watched a news report from their darkened living room. The segment showed his face, then Jackson's, then the president's angry posts. Look at this, Carol. I've made a mess. Now that actor is in trouble, the president is yelling. I just wanted them to fix my appointment. Carol, a pragmatic woman who had managed their household through deployments and disappointments, took his hand. Arthur, you didn't do anything wrong, she insisted, her voice firm. You told the truth. What they do with it is on them, not on you. Don't you dare take the blame for their foolishness. But Arthur couldn't shake the feeling that he had caused the chaos. He was a private man, a man who believed in order and chain of command. This public, messy, and loud conflict was everything he was not. He felt exposed, vulnerable, and deeply regretful. The professional cost for Samuel L. Jackson began to materialize on the third day. His agent, a man usually unflappable, called with a tangible problem. Sam, the studio's insurance underwriters for the new picture are asking questions, he said, the stress evident in his voice. They're talking about a political risk rider. They see the threats, they see you going head-to-head with the White House, and they're getting nervous. This is real-world stuff, Sam. The threats had indeed escalated beyond online trolling. An email sent to his publicist's office described Jackson's home address and travel schedule in chilling detail. It was a clear and credible threat, forcing his team to hire a private security detail. Cars with tinted windows now sat at the end of his driveway. He was no longer just a celebrity. He was a target. That night, sitting with LaTanya, the weight of it all began to settle in. The constant hum of the news, the presence of security outside, the endless stream of notifications on his phone was a siege. They're trying to make me the issue, Jackson said, staring at his phone, which displayed a news alert about another presidential attack. "They're trying to bury that man, Arthur, under all of this noise." "Of course they are, Sam," Latanya said, placing a hand on his shoulder. "That's how the game is played. They will try to make you regret this so much that no one else dares to step out of line again. The question is, are you going to let them?" He looked at her, seeing the unwavering support in her eyes, and his resolve hardened again. "No," he said, a quiet fire returning to his voice. "I'm not. But I can't beat them at their game. Shouting louder isn't the answer." He knew he needed something else. He needed to change the battlefield entirely. He didn't know how, but he knew the current trajectory. A slugfest between him and the president was a losing proposition. The truth of Arthur Pendleton was getting lost in the crossfire. The change came 4 days later, from the most unexpected of quarters. It arrived not as a viral video or an angry tweet, but in the quiet, dignified form of a letter to the editor. It appeared simultaneously in the country's most respected newspapers, from the liberal-leaning New York Times to the conservative Wall Street Journal. The author was General Marcus Thorne, a retired 4-star general who had served under 3 different presidents from both parties. Thorne was a legend in the military community, a man of immense integrity and strategic brilliance who had famously refused all offers to enter the political arena upon his retirement, choosing a quiet life in rural Virginia. He had never, in his entire career, publicly commented on the actions of a sitting commander-in-chief. Until now. His letter was a masterpiece of devastating understatement. It did not mention Samuel L. Jackson. It did not mention Donald Trump. It began simply, "To the editor, a nation's character can be measured by the promises it keeps. Chief among these is the sacred covenant between a republic and its defenders. This is not a matter of policy, but of honor. It is a debt that can never be fully repaid, but it must always be dutifully serviced." The letter went on to clinically dismantle the argument of bureaucratic necessity. "We are now hearing discussions of administrative efficiency and budgetary restructuring in relation to the care of our veterans," Thorne wrote. Such language, while appropriate for a corporate balance sheet, is dangerously misplaced when applied to this solemn obligation. Recent events suggest this covenant is being treated with a degree of administrative carelessness that borders on contempt. A nation that views its defenders as an entry on a ledger, a cost to be minimized, has lost its moral compass. The final paragraph landed with the force of an artillery shell. "There is no enemy more insidious than indifference. There is no strategic failure more absolute than forgetting those who guaranteed our freedoms. Let it be remembered that a nation that forgets its defenders will itself be forgotten." The impact was seismic. General Thorne's letter completely reset the terms of the debate. The White House could dismiss Samuel L. Jackson as a Hollywood liberal, but they could not dismiss General Thorne. He was untouchable, a figure whose patriotism and expertise were beyond reproach. His intervention gave cover to dozens of Republican lawmakers who had been privately uneasy but publicly silent. Now they began to speak out, framing their concern in the language Thorne had provided, a matter of national honor. The narrative was no longer Trump versus Hollywood. It was now about a fundamental American promise. And a respected general had just signaled that the president was on the wrong side of it. The pressure on the administration became unbearable. The VA secretary was summoned to emergency meetings. The White House was in full damage control mode. Seeing the shift, Samuel L. Jackson knew it was his moment to end the fight on his own terms. The flood of interview requests from every network was overwhelming, but he turned them all down. He would not take a victory lap. He would not sit across from a news anchor and debate the president. He owed his final words on the matter to the man who started it all. He propped up his phone in the same spot as before and recorded a second and final video. He appeared calmer this time, the cold anger replaced by a sense of solemn purpose. "A few days ago," he began, "a voice of great moral clarity and authority spoke up. General Marcus Thorne reminded the country what the word honor means. I and every American thank him for his leadership. He then shifted his focus. But this was never about me, or the president, or even the general. It started with a man named Arthur Pendleton, a man who was made to feel ashamed for asking for a promise to be kept. Jackson looked directly into the camera, but this time it felt as if he were speaking to an audience of one. "Mr. Pendleton," he said, his voice imbued with respect. "Arthur, you have absolutely nothing to be ashamed of. You served your country with honor. The shame belongs to a system that made you feel like you had to beg. That shame is not yours to carry, it is theirs." He broadened his message one last time, to everyone who shared their stories in the last week, to all the other Arthurs out there. You are not invisible. The whole country is watching now. This was never about one man or one clinic. It's about that promise. It's about making sure that check never bounces again, for anyone. He then announced his final move. "I'm working with established veterans aid foundations to create a new rapid response fund, a fund to provide immediate legal and logistical support for any vet who gets lost in the bureaucratic shuffle. We can't let good people be erased by paperwork," he concluded. "The conversation is started. Now the work begins. Let's make it good." He posted the video. There would be no more from him on this matter. He had taken the national stage, exposed a raw nerve, weathered the personal and political storm, and then gracefully ceded the floor, leaving behind not a political victory, but a tangible solution, and a powerfully reaffirmed principle. He had won, not by shouting louder, but by making the country listen to a quiet man's shame. The political fallout was swift and decisive. Within a week of Jackson's second video, with pressure mounting from all sides, and General Thorne's words still echoing in Washington, the White House executed a classic political pivot. There was no admission of fault, no apology. Instead, President Trump appeared in the White House Rose Garden, flanked by the VA secretary and a hand-picked group of veterans. He announced a bold new Veterans First Action Initiative. With the cameras rolling, he signed an executive order that not only reversed the budgetary reallocations, but also allocated an additional emergency fund to clear patient backlogs in VA clinics nationwide. "We have heard the concerns of our great heroes, and as your president, I always listen," Trump declared, taking full credit for the solution to a problem he had days earlier refused to acknowledge. "This initiative will ensure that every veteran receives the world-class care they have earned and that they so richly deserve. It was my idea from the beginning, and we are getting it done." It was a masterclass in political face-saving. But beneath the spin, the reality was undeniable. It was a quiet, unconditional surrender. The policy was changed. The money was restored. The check, which had bounced, was finally being made good. In Ohio, the news vans were gone. Arthur Pendleton's street was quiet again. The day after the president's Rose Garden announcement, Arthur received a phone call. The caller ID showed it was from the VA. He hesitated, then answered. It was not a clerk on the line, but the director of the entire regional VA center. "Mr. Pendleton," the director began, his voice exuding a nervous formality. "My name is Director Evans. I'm calling personally to apologize for the administrative error that led to the cancellation of your appointment. It was unacceptable." He informed Arthur that an appointment had been scheduled for him with the region's top audiologist for the following Tuesday. "We are clearing our entire backlog, sir," the director added. "Your case brought a serious issue to our attention." After he hung up, Arthur sat in his armchair, the receiver still resting in his lap. He looked at Carol, who was watching him from the doorway. A slow smile spread across his face, the first genuine smile she had seen in weeks. The immense weight of his shame had finally lifted, replaced by a quiet, profound sense of vindication. Later that evening, watching the national news, they learned that his experience wasn't an isolated fix. The report detailed how VA clinics across the country were scrambling to reschedule appointments and hire staff to comply with the new executive order. His small, reluctant moment of truth had triggered an avalanche of change. "You see, Arthur," Carol said, squeezing his shoulder, "you didn't start a fight. You finished one." His dignity, which he thought he'd lost forever outside that clinic, was fully restored. But the story's most significant echo wasn't felt in the halls of power or even in Arthur Pendleton's quiet living room. It resonated 2 weeks later in a small apartment in San Diego, where a 28-year-old former Marine sergeant named Maya Torres was fighting a war no one could see. 2 years after her honorable discharge, she was being systematically defeated by her own mind. The hypervigilance she had honed in Afghanistan now made a trip to the grocery store feel like a life-or-death mission. The nightmares left her drenched in sweat and terrified of sleep. She had been diagnosed with PTSD, but to Maya, the diagnosis felt like a brand of failure. She was a Marine. Marines were strong. They didn't break. She saw her struggle as a deep, personal failing, a stain on her service. She had been skipping her VA therapy appointments for months, telling her family back in Texas that she was doing great. The shame of admitting she needed help was a heavier burden than the trauma itself. She was scrolling aimlessly through her phone one night, trying to numb the anxiety, when she came across a clip of Samuel L. Jackson's second video. She hadn't paid much attention to the news story when it first broke. It had all seemed like more political noise, but for some reason, she pressed play. She listened as he thanked the general, as he announced the fund. And then he looked into the camera and spoke to Arthur Pendleton. "The shame belongs to a system that made you feel like you had to beg," Jackson said. "That shame is not yours to carry, it is theirs." The words struck Maya with the force of a physical impact. She rewound the video and played that part again and again. "That shame is not yours to carry." For 2 years, she had been carrying her shame like a rucksack filled with stones, convinced it was hers alone to bear. The idea that the shame wasn't a personal defect, but a misplaced burden put upon her by a system and a culture that didn't know how to welcome its warriors home, was revolutionary. It was like a key turning in a lock she didn't even know existed. For the first time, she saw a path out of her self-imposed isolation. The shame wasn't gone, but it no longer looked like an insurmountable wall. It looked like something she could set down. She scrolled through her contacts, past the number for the VA clinic she had been ignoring. She stopped on a name. Dad. Her father was a retired Army first sergeant, a man from a generation that never spoke of such things. Her greatest fear had been his disappointment. Her thumb hovered over the call button. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Then she thought of Jackson's final words. "Let's make it good." She pressed the button, picked up on the second ring. "Maya Bean, everything okay?" Tears welled in her eyes, but her voice, when it came, was steady. It was the voice of a sergeant taking her first step onto new ground. "Dad," she began, taking a shaky breath, I'm not okay. I haven't been okay for a while." She heard a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. "I need help." In the silence that followed, Maya braced for the disappointment she had always feared. Instead, she heard the gruff, gentle voice of her father, cleared of all pretense. "Okay, Sergeant," he said softly. "Okay. Tell me what you need. We're in this together." In that moment of shared vulnerability, a promise was kept. The echo of a stand taken for one man's dignity had traveled across the country, inspiring a quiet act of courage that would finally allow a young veteran to begin her journey home. What does it truly mean for a nation to keep its promises? Samuel L. Jackson's actions forced a conversation, but the work is done by ordinary people like Maya Torres every day. Let us know in the comments what you think. And for more stories that go beyond the headlines, don't forget to like and subscribe.